In the quiet countryside of medieval France, far from royal courts and battlefields, a young peasant girl once claimed she could hear the voice of heaven. She was not born into nobility. She was not trained as a soldier. She had never commanded an army or stood before a king. Yet before she turned 19, she would lead French forces to historic victories, change the course of the Hundred Years' War, and become one of the most extraordinary figures in European history. Her name was Joan of Arc. Some believed she was chosen by God. Others believed she was a dangerous rebel. But whether saint, warrior, or martyr, her story would echo across centuries as a symbol of faith, courage, and sacrifice. Tonight, we follow the journey of a girl who stepped from a quiet village and walked directly into legend. The voices in the fields. Long before Joan of Arc stood before kings or marched beside soldiers, she was simply a farmer's daughter growing up in a small village called Domremy. Nestled between forests and open fields in northeastern France, Domremy was quiet and isolated. Life there followed the rhythm of seasons rather than the movements of armies or politics. Villagers rose with the sun, tended livestock, worked the land, and gathered each evening beneath dim candlelight. Joan's childhood was shaped by simplicity. She was born around 1412 into a family of modest means. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, worked as a farmer and occasionally helped oversee village affairs. Her mother, Isabelle Romy, was known for her deep religious devotion and gentle guidance. From her mother, Joan learned prayers, stories of saints, and the importance of unwavering faith. Joan never learned to read or write, like most peasant children of her time. Her education came from church sermons, oral traditions, and the natural world surrounding her. She helped spin wool, care for animals, and assist her family with daily chores. By all appearances, her life seemed destined to remain quiet and unremarkable. But the world beyond Domremy was anything but peaceful. France in Joan's childhood was fractured by the long and brutal conflict known as the Hundred Years' War. For generations, England and France had fought over claims to the French throne. Entire regions had been burned, villages destroyed, and families displaced by constant battles. By the early 15th century, France was losing. English forces, allied with the powerful Burgundians, had captured vast territories. The French monarchy was weakened by internal political struggles. The rightful heir to the throne, Charles, known as the Dauphin, struggled to maintain control over the remaining loyal regions of the kingdom. Rumors of war reached even the peaceful fields of Domremy. Travelers passed through the village carrying stories of burned towns and massacred communities. Occasionally, soldiers marched through nearby roads, reminding villagers that conflict was never far away. Some families fled from destroyed lands, seeking refuge. Fear quietly settled into everyday life. Joan grew up listening to these stories. She heard adults speak in hushed voices about lost battles and uncertain futures. She witnessed the growing anxiety of a country unsure whether it could survive. Though she was young, she absorbed the tension surrounding her homeland. Yet Joan herself remained known as a gentle and deeply spiritual child. Neighbors later described her as unusually pious. She attended church frequently, often spending long moments in silent prayer. She was said to show kindness to the poor and maintain a seriousness uncommon for someone her age. No one suspected that her life would soon change forever. One summer afternoon, when Joan was about 13 years old, she was working in her father's garden. The sun stood high above the fields, and the village rested in the stillness of early afternoon. The air carried the scent of grass and warm earth. It was during this quiet moment, according to Joan's later testimony, that she experienced something she would never forget. She heard a voice. At first, it startled her. She described it as clear and filled with authority, yet gentle. She turned, searching for someone nearby, but no one stood around her. The fields remained empty. The wind moved softly through the crops. The voice spoke again. Joan later claimed that it came accompanied by a bright light, radiant, overwhelming, and unlike anything she had ever seen. Fear filled her, but she also felt an unexpected sense of calm. Over time, she would come to believe that the voice belonged to Saint Michael, the archangel, accompanied by Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, holy figures revered within Christian tradition. The message they carried was extraordinary. They told her she had been chosen for a divine mission. At first, Joan struggled to understand what she was hearing. She was a young peasant girl with no education, no political knowledge, and no connection to royal courts. The idea that she might be called to influence the fate of France seemed impossible. She kept the experiences secret. For months, she continued her daily chores, attended church, and lived quietly among her family. But the voices returned repeatedly. Each time, they grew more urgent. They spoke of France's suffering and insisted that she must help restore the kingdom. Eventually, the message became clear. She was told she must help the Dauphin Charles reclaim his rightful throne. She was told she would lead France to victory. She was told that God had chosen her as his instrument. The weight of such a command would have crushed most people, especially a young teenager. Joan wrestled with fear and doubt. She worried about how her family and neighbors might react. She questioned whether she had misunderstood what she heard. Yet the voices never left her. They became a constant presence, guiding her thoughts, shaping her faith, and strengthening her resolve. As years passed, the war around France worsened. English forces tightened their control over key territories. One of the most devastating threats emerged in the city of Orleans, a strategic location whose fall would open the path for English domination over central France. News of these dangers reached Domremy through merchants and refugees. Joan felt the urgency growing within her. She began speaking cautiously about her mission to trusted individuals. Some dismissed her as a dreamer. Others saw sincerity in her conviction, but feared the consequences of believing her. Her family, especially her father, opposed the idea of her leaving home. According to later accounts, he reportedly feared she might bring shame or danger upon the family if she pursued such visions. But Joan's determination hardened. She believed her calling came from God. To ignore it would mean betraying divine command. She prayed constantly, asking for strength and clarity. With each passing month, her confidence grew stronger than her fear. By the time she reached 16, Joan had made her decision. She would leave Domremy. She would seek an audience with the Dauphin Charles. And she would attempt to convince soldiers, nobles, and priests that a peasant girl had been sent by heaven to save France. Before she departed, Joan visited the village church one final time as an ordinary girl. Inside, candles flickered against stone walls worn by generations of worshippers. She knelt in prayer, surrounded by the familiar silence of her childhood sanctuary. It was a moment filled with uncertainty, but also unwavering faith. Outside those walls lay a journey no peasant girl had ever taken before. She would soon step into a world of war, politics, suspicion, and danger, a world that would either reject her completely or transform her into legend. As Joan left the quiet fields of Domremy behind, she carried no weapons, no royal title, and no military training. She carried only her belief that she had been chosen for a purpose greater than herself. And that belief would change the fate of a nation. The girl who faced the Dauphin. By the time Joan of Arc left her village of Domremy, France was standing on the edge of collapse. The 100 Years' War had drained the kingdom for generations. English armies, supported by Burgundian allies, controlled vast regions of northern France. Cities had fallen one by one, and hope within the French court had begun to fade. At the center of this fragile resistance stood Charles, the Dauphin of France, the man who should have been king but had never been crowned. He lived in uncertainty, surrounded by advisors who doubted his legitimacy and nobles who questioned his strength. Many believed he lacked the courage and leadership needed to save France. It was to this uncertain prince that Joan of Arc believed she had been sent. Her journey from Domremy was neither safe nor simple. Travel across wartime France meant passing through territories filled with bandits, enemy patrols, and political suspicion. Joan first sought help in the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, where she requested an audience with Robert de Baudricourt, a local military commander loyal to Charles. When she first arrived, she was dismissed. Baudricourt saw only a young peasant girl claiming divine visions. To him, her request to meet the Dauphin sounded absurd. War decisions were made by nobles, generals, and clergy, not farm girls with stories of heavenly voices. Joan did not give up. She returned repeatedly, speaking with unwavering conviction. She described her mission with calm certainty, insisting that France would suffer great defeat if her warnings were ignored. She spoke with a confidence that unsettled those who listened. Some mocked her, some feared she might be mad, but others began to notice something unusual. She showed no hesitation, no arrogance, and no desire for personal power. Her faith appeared absolute. Eventually, as French defeats continued to worsen, curiosity overcame skepticism. Baudricourt agreed to send Joan to meet Charles. Before she departed, she was given male military clothing for protection during travel. The decision would later become one of the accusations used against her, but at that moment, it was necessary for survival on dangerous roads. Accompanied by a small escort, Joan began the long journey across enemy territory toward the Dauphin's court. The road to Chinon, where Charles resided, stretched through lands scarred by war. Villages lay burned and abandoned. Fields once filled with crops had turned into battlegrounds. Refugees wandered roads searching for safety. The suffering of France was visible everywhere Joan traveled. Yet witnesses later described her as calm throughout the journey. She spoke little about fear. Instead, she prayed frequently, believing she was being guided toward her destiny. After weeks of travel, she finally arrived at the royal court in Chinon. But gaining an audience with the Dauphin would prove far more difficult than reaching the castle itself. Charles's advisors viewed Joan as a potential threat. Medieval courts were filled with political intrigue, and many feared she might be a spy or manipulator sent by enemies. Others worried that allowing a peasant girl to influence royal decisions could damage the fragile authority Charles still possessed. For days, she was questioned and observed. Clergy members examined her religious beliefs. Nobles studied her behavior. She remained composed, answering questions with humility and confidence. She insisted that her mission came directly from God and that she had been sent to help Charles reclaim his throne. Finally, Charles agreed to test her. According to historical accounts and later testimonies, Charles disguised himself among members of his court when Joan entered the Great Hall at Chinon. He wanted to see whether she could identify him without being told. The hall was filled with nobles dressed in rich garments. Candlelight flickered across polished floors, reflecting the wealth and authority of the royal court. For a peasant girl from Domremy, the scene must have been overwhelming. Yet Joan walked calmly into the room. She looked around carefully, then moved directly toward Charles, ignoring the more elaborately dressed nobles who stood closer to the throne. She knelt before him and addressed him as the rightful Dauphin of France. The court fell silent. No one could explain how she recognized him. Some later claimed it was coincidence. Others believed it was proof of divine guidance. But from that moment, Charles's curiosity deepened. He agreed to speak privately with her. During their meeting, Joan delivered a message she claimed came from heaven. She told Charles that he was the true heir to the French throne and that God had chosen him to rule. She promised that she would help lead French forces to victory and ensure he would be crowned king in the traditional cathedral at Reims, a ceremony that symbolized legitimate authority in France. Charles listened carefully. He had spent years surrounded by doubt, betrayal, and political weakness. Hearing such absolute certainty from a young girl may have seemed both strange and strangely comforting. Still, he could not rely on belief alone. Before trusting Joan, he ordered her to be examined by church authorities in the city of Poitiers. If she were found to be heretical or deceptive, her mission would end immediately. The examination at Poitiers lasted weeks. Clergy members questioned Joan intensely about her visions, her faith, and her knowledge of Christian teachings. Medieval religious authorities were cautious about claims of divine communication, fearing heresy or manipulation. Joan answered their questions with surprising clarity. Though she lacked formal education, she demonstrated deep understanding of religious devotion. She never claimed authority over church doctrine. She insisted only that she had been instructed by God to save France and support the Dauphin. The investigators found no evidence of heresy. While they stopped short of declaring her visions divine, they concluded that nothing in her behavior or belief contradicted Christian teaching. More importantly, they noted her sincerity and unwavering confidence. With the church's cautious approval, Charles faced a decision. France was losing the war. His armies were demoralized. Orleans, one of the last major strongholds loyal to him, was under siege. If the city fell, English victory would become almost certain. Joan insisted she could help lift the siege. For a desperate prince, the risk began to feel worth taking. Charles made an extraordinary choice. He granted Joan armor, a banner, and command influence alongside experienced military leaders. Though she was not officially made a general, her presence would inspire troops and symbolize divine support for the French cause. Witnesses later described the moment Joan first received her armor. The metal plates reflected candlelight as servants adjusted the pieces around her frame. For the first time, the peasant girl from Domremy appeared as a warrior. Yet she carried no sword as her symbol. Instead, she held a white banner decorated with religious imagery and the names of Jesus and Mary. The banner would become her true weapon, a symbol of faith and hope. As news spread through the army, soldiers reacted with curiosity and excitement. Many had lost faith after years of defeat. The arrival of a young woman claiming divine mission sparked renewed belief that victory might still be possible. Joan spoke to soldiers with confidence and compassion. She encouraged prayer, discipline, and moral conduct. She insisted that their cause was righteous and that heaven supported their fight. Her words carried unexpected power. In early 1429, Joan prepared to lead French forces toward Orleans. The city had endured months of siege by English troops. Its fall would break French resistance entirely. Military commanders remained cautious, but morale among soldiers began to rise simply because she marched beside them. As Joan rode with the army, dressed in shining armor and carrying her banner, she transformed from an unknown peasant girl into a living symbol of hope. Behind her stretched an army seeking salvation. Ahead of her waited one of the most important battles in French history. And for the first time, Joan of Arc would step onto a battlefield, not as a spectator, but as a leader whose faith would soon be tested by war itself. The Maiden of Orleans. By the spring of 1429, the city of Orleans stood as France's final shield against collapse. For months, English forces had surrounded the city, building fortified positions along the Loire River and tightening their grip day by day. Supply routes were cut. Food grew scarce. Fear spread through the population like a slow, suffocating fog. If Orleans fell, the road to southern France would open, and the Dauphin Charles would likely lose his last strongholds of support. Inside the city, soldiers prepared for defeat. Many had fought for years and watched as one French fortress after another surrendered or burned. Morale had withered. Even experienced commanders doubted that Orleans could survive much longer. It was into this desperate situation that Joan of Arc rode. When Joan approached the city with French reinforcements, rumors spread ahead of her arrival. Soldiers whispered about the young woman dressed in armor who claimed to be sent by God. Some dismissed the stories as superstition. Others, exhausted by years of loss, clung to the hope that she might truly carry divine favor. Joan entered Orleans on the evening of April 29, 1429. Witnesses described crowds gathering along the streets as she rode through the city gates, her white banner lifted high. Torches illuminated her armor, causing it to glow in the darkness. Bells rang from churches, and civilians watched with a mixture of awe and desperate hope. To them, she appeared not just as a soldier, but as a sign that France had not been abandoned by heaven. Despite her inspiring presence, Joan faced immediate resistance from French military leaders. Experienced commanders believed in cautious strategy. They preferred defensive tactics and feared reckless assaults against heavily fortified English positions. To them, Joan was a symbolic figure, not a battlefield decision-maker. Joan, however, believed her mission demanded action. She insisted that God had sent her not simply to inspire soldiers, but to drive the English out of France. She urged commanders to launch attacks rather than remain trapped behind city walls. Her confidence unsettled many officers. She had no formal military training, no noble background, and no battlefield experience. Yet she spoke with authority that made even seasoned soldiers hesitate before dismissing her. Over the next several days, tension grew between Joan's determination and the caution of French commanders. Eventually, events would force them to act. The English had built several fortified strongholds surrounding Orleans, designed to isolate the city completely. One of the most critical positions stood at a fortress known as St. Lou. On May 4th, French forces launched an assault. Joan rode beside the troops, carrying her banner rather than wielding a weapon. Witnesses later reported that she rarely fought directly, but remained constantly near the front lines, encouraging soldiers and calling them forward with remarkable fearlessness. As French troops advanced towards St. Lou, fierce fighting erupted. Arrows darkened the sky. The clash of steel echoed across the battlefield. Smoke from burning barricades blurred the air. For soldiers already worn down by years of defeat, the attack demanded courage they were not certain they possessed. But Joan's presence changed something. She moved among the soldiers, urging them to continue, reminding them that their cause was blessed by God. Her unwavering confidence spread through the ranks. What had begun as cautious aggression slowly transformed into determined assault. By evening, the fortress of St. Lou fell into French hands. It was the first major victory near Orleans in months. And it was only the beginning. Over the following days, Joan pushed for continued attacks against English positions surrounding the city. Each victory strengthened French morale and weakened English confidence. Soldiers who once feared battle now rushed forward with renewed energy. Civilians inside Orleans began to believe survival was possible. But the most dangerous English stronghold remained. South of the Loire River stood a heavily fortified complex known as Les Tourelles. It guarded a vital bridge and represented the strongest point in the English siege network. Many commanders considered it nearly impossible to capture. Joan insisted it must fall. On May 7th, French forces launched their assault against Les Tourelles. The battle was brutal. English defenders unleashed waves of arrows and projectiles from towering walls. French soldiers struggled to cross defensive trenches and burning barricades. Casualties mounted rapidly. For hours, neither side gained clear advantage. During the assault, Joan stood near the front, raising her banner to rally advancing troops. Then disaster struck. An arrow pierced her shoulder, knocking her from the battlefield. For a moment, panic spread among French forces. Many soldiers believed their divine symbol had fallen. The sight of Joan wounded threatened to break the fragile morale she had built. She was carried away from the fighting, bleeding heavily. Pain and exhaustion overwhelmed her, and some commanders considered withdrawing from the assault entirely. But Joan refused. After receiving treatment, she returned to the battlefield later that same day. Witnesses described her reappearing with her banner raised, calling soldiers to continue the attack. Her return stunned both French and English forces. To French soldiers, it appeared miraculous. To English defenders, it suggested an enemy driven by unshakable conviction. Inspired by her return, French troops launched a renewed assault. They stormed defensive positions with relentless determination. By evening, Les Tourelles fell into French control. The siege of Orleans was broken. When news spread across France, it carried the force of legend. A city believed to be lost had been saved. English forces, once thought unstoppable, had been driven back by an army inspired by a teenage peasant girl claiming divine guidance. Joan of Arc became known as the Maid of Orleans. But her greatest impact was not military victory alone. She had transformed the spirit of the French army. Soldiers who had accepted defeat began to believe in victory. Nobles who had doubted the Dauphin started reconsidering his legitimacy. Ordinary citizens saw hope return to a war-torn nation. Joan herself remained focused on her next mission. She insisted that victory at Orleans was only the beginning. Her true goal, she reminded Charles and his advisors, was to escort him to the city of Reims, where French kings were traditionally crowned. Without that coronation, she believed France would remain divided. The road to Reims, however, lay deep within territory controlled by English and Burgundian forces. The journey would require a series of dangerous military campaigns. Many commanders feared the risk. But after Orleans, ignoring Joan's guidance seemed impossible. As French armies prepared to march north, Joan rode at the head of a force that now viewed her as more than a messenger of God. To them, she had become proof that destiny could change. Yet even as she rose toward legendary status, dangers gathered around her. Political rivals questioned her influence. Religious authorities continued to observe her claims cautiously. Enemies saw her as a symbol that must be destroyed. Joan herself seemed unaware of the growing storm. She believed her mission would succeed because it had been promised by heaven. But destiny rarely reveals its full path to those who follow it. And as the French army marched toward Reims, Joan of Arc moved closer not only to glory, but to the trials that would define her ultimate legacy. The crown of Reims. The victory at Orleans spread across France like the first light after a long night. For years, the French had lived under the shadow of defeat. Cities had fallen, nobles had shifted loyalties, and many had begun to believe that the English claim to the French throne was inevitable. But the lifting of the siege of Orleans changed everything. Hope returned. And at the center of that hope stood Joan of Arc. Despite the victory, Joan believed her mission was far from complete. She insisted that France could not truly be saved until the Dauphin Charles was crowned king in the Cathedral of Reims. For centuries, French kings had been crowned there, following a sacred tradition believed to grant divine legitimacy to their rule. Without that coronation, Charles remained vulnerable to political doubt. Many nobles still hesitated to support him fully. Some even questioned whether he was the rightful heir at all. Joan believed that God's plan required Charles to wear the crown. She spoke to him with unwavering certainty. Charles, now encouraged by military victories and growing public support, began to consider the possibility. Yet the journey to Reims appeared nearly impossible. The route passed through territories still controlled by English forces and their Burgundian allies. Marching there would mean moving deep into enemy territory. It was a dangerous gamble. But Joan urged him forward, insisting that fear could not guide destiny. In the summer of 1429, French forces began their march north. Joan rode beside the army, her banner carried high above rows of soldiers who now viewed her as a living miracle. Towns along their route watched their arrival with cautious curiosity. What happened next surprised even experienced military commanders. Instead of fierce resistance, many towns opened their gates willingly. Some surrendered without battle. The victories at Orleans had shaken enemy confidence and strengthened French morale. Joan's reputation traveled faster than the army itself. To many civilians and soldiers, she symbolized divine favor. Her presence alone seemed to persuade cities to reconsider their loyalties. Where battles might have once erupted, negotiations often followed instead. Still, danger remained constant. Enemy forces could have attacked at any moment. Supply lines stretched thin. Political alliances shifted unpredictably. One major defeat could have shattered everything Joan had built. Yet the march continued, step by step, across a land still scarred by war. During the campaign, Joan maintained strict expectations for discipline among French soldiers. She demanded moral conduct, forbidding looting and unnecessary violence against civilians. She insisted soldiers attend religious services and maintain unity within the ranks. Her leadership combined spiritual devotion with military urgency, creating an unusual but powerful influence over the army. Many veterans found her expectations surprising. Yet her authority grew stronger with each town that surrendered peacefully and each battlefield avoided through diplomacy rather than bloodshed. By July 1429, French forces approached the ancient city of Reims. For generations, Reims had symbolized the heart of French monarchy. Its cathedral stood as a sacred site where kings were crowned beneath towering stained glass windows and ancient stone arches. Reaching the city was only half the challenge. It still needed to welcome Charles as its king. When news arrived that Joan and the Dauphin were approaching, tension filled Reims. The city faced a dangerous decision. Supporting Charles meant risking English retaliation, but rejecting him could isolate the city from the growing French resurgence. As French forces gathered outside the walls, negotiations unfolded. Days passed with uncertainty hanging over both sides. Soldiers waited, unsure whether they would be welcomed or forced into another siege. Citizens debated their future behind the city gates. Then, finally, the gates opened. Reims accepted Charles as the rightful heir to the throne. The moment carried enormous symbolic weight. It marked not only a political victory, but the restoration of a sacred tradition interrupted by years of war. Preparations for the coronation began immediately. On July 17, 1429, the Cathedral of Reims filled with nobles, clergy, soldiers, and citizens eager to witness history. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful reflections across stone floors. Bells rang throughout the city, announcing the arrival of a ceremony that would shape the destiny of France. Charles walked toward the altar to receive the crown that generations before him had worn. And beside him stood Joan of Arc. Witnesses described her presence during the ceremony as deeply symbolic. She wore her armor, carrying her white banner. When asked why she stood so close to the king, she reportedly answered that her banner had endured the hardships of battle and therefore deserved to share in the moment of victory. As Charles was crowned King Charles VII, cheers filled the cathedral. For many, the coronation represented the rebirth of France. For Joan, it marked the fulfillment of the mission she believed God had given her. Tears reportedly filled her eyes as she knelt before the newly crowned king, expressing relief and gratitude. She had taken a dauphin plagued by doubt and guided him to the throne through faith and determination. At that moment, Joan stood at the height of her power and influence. She had become a national hero. Yet beneath the celebration, shadows quietly gathered. Political tensions within the French court began to surface. Some nobles felt threatened by Joan's growing popularity and influence over the king. Military leaders questioned whether her role should continue now that the coronation had been achieved. Joan herself believed the war must continue until English forces were fully expelled from France. She urged Charles to push forward aggressively, especially toward Paris, which remained under enemy control. But Charles hesitated. As king, he now faced responsibilities that demanded caution. Diplomacy, alliances, and negotiations became as important as military victories. Advisors encouraged him to stabilize his rule rather than risk reckless campaigns. For the first time, Joan's determination began to clash with royal caution. Despite rising political resistance, Joan continued to fight. She joined military campaigns aimed at expanding French control around Paris. However, the unity and momentum that had carried her army to Reims began to weaken. French forces faced stronger resistance, and internal disagreements slowed decision-making. During an assault on Paris in September 1429, Joan was wounded again. The attack ultimately failed. The setback marked a turning point. Charles gradually reduced military operations, choosing negotiation over continued warfare. Joan, however, remained committed to her mission of driving English forces from France entirely. The distance between her vision and the king's strategy grew wider. And as political priorities shifted, Joan found herself increasingly isolated. By early 1430, Joan continued fighting alongside smaller French forces without the full support of the royal court. Her legend remained powerful among soldiers and civilians, but her influence over national strategy had begun to fade. Still, she refused to abandon her mission. She believed her calling came from heaven, not from political approval. Wherever battles threatened French towns, she rode toward them, carrying her banner and her unwavering faith. It was during one of these campaigns, near the town of Compiègne, that Joan's fate would change forever. Unaware of the trap forming around her, she rode into battle as she always had, fearless, devoted, and convinced that her mission was not yet finished. But destiny, which had lifted her from a village field to the halls of kings, was about to lead her toward its darkest chapter. The Trial of Fire. By the spring of 1430, Joan of Arc was no longer marching at the head of a royal army. The glory of Reims had faded into uneasy silence. Political caution had replaced bold military campaigns. King Charles VII, now securely crowned, turned his attention toward diplomacy and stability rather than relentless warfare. But Joan could not stop. She believed her mission was unfinished. English forces and their Burgundian allies still occupied large regions of France. To Joan, peace without victory meant betrayal of the divine purpose she believed had guided her since childhood. And so, without the full backing of the royal court, she continued fighting. It would lead her toward her final battle. In May 1430, Joan joined French forces defending the town of Compiègne against Burgundian troops allied with England. The battlefield unfolded along narrow roads and fortified gates. Skirmishes erupted as French defenders attempted to push enemy forces away from the town's walls. Joan, as always, rode near the front lines, encouraging soldiers and directing movement with her banner raised high. The fighting grew chaotic. As evening approached, Burgundian forces launched a strong counterattack. French troops began retreating toward the town gates for safety. Amid the confusion, Joan remained outside the walls, continuing to rally retreating soldiers. Then, disaster struck. As she attempted to re-enter the city, the gates of Compiègne closed behind retreating troops, either from panic, strategic decision, or tragic miscommunication. Joan was left outside, surrounded by enemy forces. She fought as long as she could, but she was eventually pulled from her horse and captured. The girl who had once stood beside kings now found herself a prisoner of war. Joan's capture sent shockwaves across France. To English commanders and their allies, she was more than a soldier. She was a symbol of French resistance and divine legitimacy. Destroying her reputation would weaken the spirit she had inspired across the kingdom. Instead of executing her immediately as a military prisoner, her enemies chose a different path. They would put her on trial. If they could prove she was a heretic, a false prophet who claimed divine authority, they could shatter her legend and discredit the king she had helped crown. Joan was sold to English custody and transferred to the city of Rouen, a stronghold under English control. There, her final battle would begin, not with weapons, but with words. The trial of Joan of Arc began in early 1431. She stood alone against a court dominated by English-supported clergy determined to condemn her. The proceedings were complex, filled with theological questions, political motives, and legal traps designed to force her into contradiction. Joan was only 19 years old. She had no legal training, no formal education, and no advisor allowed to defend her. Yet over weeks of interrogation, she faced experienced scholars and church officials with remarkable composure. They questioned her visions. They challenged her claim that saints spoke to her. They accused her of defying church authority. They condemned her for wearing male military clothing. Every question carried danger. Any incorrect answer could lead to immediate execution. Yet Joan responded with calm intelligence and spiritual certainty that stunned her interrogators. When asked whether she believed she was in God's grace, a theological trap designed to condemn her regardless of her answer, Joan replied with words that would echo through history. "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God keep me there." Her response avoided condemnation while demonstrating deep religious understanding far beyond her education. Still, the outcome of the trial was already leaning toward execution. For months, Joan endured imprisonment under harsh conditions. Unlike typical female prisoners, she was held in an English military prison guarded by male soldiers rather than within church custody. She remained chained and isolated, facing constant pressure to confess her visions were false. Eventually, under threat of immediate execution, Joan briefly signed a document agreeing to abandon certain claims and wear traditional female clothing. But soon after, she resumed wearing male attire, reportedly because guards removed her female clothing or because she believed her safety depended on it. This action allowed her accusers to declare her a relapsed heretic, a charge punishable by death. The final sentence was sealed. Joan of Arc would be executed by burning. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan was led to the marketplace of Rouen. Crowds gathered as soldiers prepared the execution site. A wooden stake rose from a platform surrounded by bundles of firewood. Clergy stood nearby reading formal condemnations. English soldiers watched closely, determined to ensure the end of the young woman who had once terrified their armies. Witnesses later described Joan as frightened, but composed. She requested a cross to hold as she faced death. A sympathetic soldier reportedly crafted one from 2 sticks and handed it to her. Another priest held a church cross before her eyes as she was tied to the stake. As flames were prepared beneath her, Joan prayed loudly, calling upon Jesus repeatedly. The fire was lit. Smoke rose first, curling upward into the sky. Flames followed, consuming the wood beneath her feet. Witnesses reported that she continued praying until her voice was lost within the roar of the fire. She died at 19 years old. To ensure no relics could become symbols of worship, her remains were burned repeatedly, and her ashes were scattered into the Seine River. The English believed they had erased her legend. They were wrong. News of Joan's execution spread quickly across France. Rather than destroying her legacy, her death transformed her into a martyr. Stories of her courage, faith, and sacrifice spread among soldiers and civilians alike. Many began to believe that her mission had been truly divine, strengthened by her willingness to die rather than deny her beliefs. Years later, after English power weakened and French victory became certain, King Charles VII authorized a retrial of Joan's case. In 1456, church authorities officially declared her original trial unjust and politically motivated. Joan of Arc was proclaimed innocent, restoring her honor and reputation. Centuries later, in 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. From a quiet village girl to military leader, from royal advisor to prisoner, from condemned heretic to national heroine, Joan of Arc's life lasted less than 2 decades. Yet her story reshaped a nation and inspired generations far beyond the battlefield. She became a symbol of faith against doubt, courage against overwhelming odds, and conviction powerful enough to change history. Her banner no longer waves across battlefields, but her story continues to rise, like a flame that time could never extinguish. The flame that never faded. And so, the story of Joan of Arc comes to a quiet end. A girl born in a small village, who never sought power, never desired glory, yet walked into history guided only by faith and conviction. She led armies without being trained as a soldier. She stood before kings without being born into royalty. And when she faced death, she held on to her belief with a courage that no fire could destroy. Joan's life was brief, but her legacy became eternal. Long after the wars ended, long after kingdoms rose and fell, her name remained a symbol of bravery, devotion, and the mysterious power of belief. Perhaps she was a messenger of heaven. Perhaps she was simply a young woman who refused to surrender to fear. But history remembers her as something more. Not just a warrior, not just a martyr. A legend. Thank you for listening. And whenever you return to the past, another story will always be waiting to be told.